Welcome back to the deep dive. Today we are tackling, well, a pretty massive task, trying to predict a fundamental piece of future global infrastructure. We're asking one of the biggest questions out there for power system planners. How much electricity will the world actually need? And maybe even more importantly, what exactly will we need it? Hour by hour. So our mission today is to really unpack the methods and the findings of a major research paper. It's titled Long-Term Load Projection and High Resolution for All Countries Globally. And just to be clear, this isn't about next year's forecast. We're talking about mapping out the precise hourly demand curve for almost every country on Earth, looking way, way out to the year 2100. That's what, 80 plus years?
That time frame, yeah, and the resolution hourly global all the way to 2100, that's really what sets this study apart. It's a landmark piece. Traditionally, power system research tends to focus either on super accurate short-term forecasts, like for the next day or week.
Right, for grid operations.
Exactly. Or, on the other end, very broad, kind of low-resolution studies looking at total energy consumption decades from now. Annual numbers, maybe?
But that's not enough anymore, is it? If you're trying to build a grid around renewables like solar and wind, which are variable, you can't just know the total for the year. You absolutely need to know the peak demand on, say, the hottest afternoon in August, 50 years from now. You need that high-res picture.
Precisely. And this research aims to fill that huge strategic gap. But of course, it immediately makes you wonder, how on earth do you even start trying to predict the moment-to-moment energy behavior of billions of people over, well, 8 decades?
That really is the crux of it, isn't it? Modeling hourly demand for 180 countries up to 2,100. I mean, the number of variables seems astronomical. What's the trick? How did they approach this complexity?
Well, the core approach is grounded in some pretty advanced statistical modeling. Specifically, they lean heavily on something called spectral analysis.
Okay, spectral analysis. Sounds technical.
It does, but don't let the term scare you off. Think of it like this. It's about recognizing and projecting the natural, repeating rhythms in how we use energy.
Rhythms.
Yeah, rhythms. Your own energy use has a rhythm.
Yeah.
It probably spikes when you wake up, maybe dips mid-morning, peaks again in the evening when you get home, turn on lights, cook dinner.
Sure, yeah. And it's lower on a weekend than a weekday.
Exactly. Or it peaks in summer or winter, depending on where you live.
Yep.
So this methodology basically takes the complex, jagged line of a country's hourly electricity use and breaks it down into 18 predictable, simpler oscillations. Think of them as sine functions, capturing those daily cycles, the weekly ups and downs, and the big annual swings.
Okay, so you identify the fundamental beats, the patterns.
Right, and once you've got those rhythms mapped out, you can project them forward.
Yeah.
Then the next step is adjusting that projection based on how you expect things like the economy and the climate to change over the long term.
That makes a lot of sense. If you've captured the sort of mechanical pattern, you just need to figure out what forces are making that pattern bigger or smaller over time. So what are those big long-term drivers they identified?
So the really long-term trajectory in the model depends heavily on socioeconomic projections. And the single most crucial factor driving up total demand is GDP per capita, measured in purchasing power parity, or PPP. The link between, rising wealth and rising electricity consumption is pretty much undeniable when you look globally.
And this study makes a pretty bold projection on that front, doesn't it? It assumes this idea of global economic convergence.
It does, yeah. They use what's called a logistic growth function. If you picture a growth curve, a logistic one starts steep but then gradually flattens out as it approaches some kind of maximum limit or a ceiling.
So it assumes there's sort of a natural limit to how wealthy or maybe how energy intensive an economy can ultimately become.
Pretty much. They projected this single global convergence point for GDP per capita, around 88,000 euro by the year 2100. Now, that number comes from modeling the historical average growth rate of the world's leading economies over the last 25 years or so, and then assuming that other countries will eventually sort of catch up to that level of productivity.
Hold on, projecting global economic parity like that 80 plus years out? That feels incredibly ambitious, maybe optimistic. I mean, that kind of convergence assumes a level of stability and coordinated growth that, well, it ignores a lot of geopolitical reality, doesn't it? What did the study say about the risks of that assumption?
That's a fair point. The convergence model is definitely a simplification, but it's almost a necessary one for this kind of long-term, large-scale modeling. It gives you a common target to aim for across all countries. But the real strength, I think, comes from what they found alongside that rising GDP. As countries get wealthier and move towards this convergence point, the efficiency of their electricity consumption actually improves quite dramatically.
Wait, hang on. So consumption per person goes up with wealth, right? But the amount of electricity needed to generate one more euro or dollar of GDP, what economists call energy intensity, that actually decreases.
That's one of the really key findings, and maybe a bit counterintuitive. Their correlation analysis showed a clear negative gradient for energy intensity in higher GDP countries.
Mhm.
It suggests that as economies mature, they either shift away from really heady energy-guzzling industries, or they just get much more efficient through better technology. So yes, the tide lifts all boats, but the boats themselves become lighter, more efficient.
Okay, so that helps set the long-term trend, adjusted for efficiency gains. But what about the minute-to-minute, day-to-day stuff? We still need to account for the biggest immediate influence, the weather.
Oh, absolutely. Temperature is, without doubt, the main immediate factor controlling demand swings. That's why the study had to incorporate hourly temperature data, which they sourced from NASA databases. Because whether it's 2 a.m. or 2 p.m., the outside temperature is what prompts millions of people to switch on their air conditioning or heating all at pretty much the same time. Capturing that hourly synchronization is absolutely vital for accurately predicting those peak loads.
Got it. And this is where, for me, the analysis gets really interesting. It moves beyond just GDP and temperature into these five specific, quite nuanced factors they introduced to fine-tune the model for different countries. These feel like the adjustments that make the model genuinely useful for planners on the ground.
Yes, exactly. You can think of them as the specific levers that shape the unique profile of a country's electricity demand. They're critical because they determine when and why the peaks happen. And maybe the best way to see why they matter is to look at what happened in the model when the researchers deliberately removed each factor.
Okay, let's do that. What's the first one?
The first is the industrial production factor. Basically, if a country has a lot of heavy industry, those factories often run 247. This pushes the overall load profile towards more of a base load characteristic. In simple terms, it flattens the demand curve a bit, reducing the difference between the lowest point, maybe in the middle of the night, and the highest daily peak.
Right, because those factories keep humming along, smoothing out the peaks and valleys caused by everyone else going home or waking up.
Precisely. Take Russia as an example. Industry accounts for something like 52% of their total electricity use. When the researchers took this factor out of the model suddenly assumed demand was mostly residential and commercial, and it massively overestimated the evening peaks. The error in predicting the peak load jumped by about 2.0%. It failed because it forgot the factories were still running.
Okay, factor two, the electric heating factor. This sounds like it's linked not just to how cold it gets, but also how the power system itself is set up.
That's exactly right. It's really driven by the economics of power generation. This factor becomes important in countries with a very high share, like 80% to 100% of generation sources that have low marginal costs. Big hydro dams, nuclear power plants, maybe geothermal. Because the electricity from these sources is steady and relatively cheap to produce once they're built, it often encourages the widespread adoption of electric heating systems over, say, gas or oil.
And France is the classic example here, with all its nuclear power.
The textbook case, yes. France gets about 89% of its power from these kinds of low-cost, steady sources. So when the researchers removed the electric heating factor for France, the model's predicted load during cold winter months fell way short of the actual load. It showed significant negative errors because it wasn't accounting for how structurally dependent French demand is on temperature due to all that electric heating.
Makes sense. Now, let's swing to the other extreme, the air conditioning factor.
Right. This one kicks in for places where it gets hot specifically, where temperatures go above 25 degrees Celsius for more than 300 hours a year. It captures that huge, almost instantaneous surge in energy demand when everyone turns on their AC. And it's not just daytime peaks in summer, it also accounts for warm summer nights and even some winter peaks where people use reverse cycle AC units for heating. The impact is just massive in warmer, densely populated areas.
How massive? Can you give us a sense of the scale?
Sure. The study looked at Japan. When they removed the AC impact from the model for Japan, the error in predicting the peak load went from a manageable managed to 6.9%, so underestimating by about 7%, all the way up to negative 17%. A huge jump. Basically, ignoring the impact of cooling makes the model completely unable to predict the maximum stress the grid will face.
Wow, okay. Factor 4 takes us into global mobility, the tourism factor.
Yeah, this was designed for countries where tourism causes significant seasonal swings in population, and therefore in energy demand. Your standard GDP-based models usually work off the resident population, which is relatively stable. This factor specifically adds demand to account for hotels, restaurants, attractions, all the extra activity that spikes during tourist season.
Like Cyprus, I think they mentioned.
Exactly. Cyprus is a great example. Tourism makes up almost 20% of their GDP. When this factor was ignored, the model showed bigger errors during the peak summer months. It just couldn't explain why the country was using so much power in July and August because it didn't account for all the visitors essentially acting like temporary residents.
And the fifth and final factor is maybe the most subtle, the sunset hours factor. It's about lighting.
It's about lighting, yeah, but also just the general increase in activity that happens in homes around twilight as natural light fades. The model uses a specific calculation to make sure this extra load only gets added starting right at sunset each day and ending around midnight, and the timing adjusts automatically based on the time of year and latitude. For a place like New Zealand, where this evening activity pattern is quite pronounced, taking this factor out made a surprisingly big difference. The peak load deviation jumped from about negative 7.5% to negative 17.5%.
So even the precise timing of sunset matters for getting the hourly prediction right.
It proves that even that predictable daily astronomical cycle is a critical input that needs to be modeled right down to the hour.
Okay, so let me try to summarize. We have this quite complex system. It uses 18 different rhythmic pattern sine waves to capture the basic pulse of daily, weekly, and yearly life. And then on top of that, it applies these 5 specific adjustments industry, heating, cooling, tourism, and sunset, to make sure that basic pulse accurately reflects the reality in 180 different countries.
That's a good way to put it. That's the core framework of the long-term load projection in high resolution for all countries globally study. Those 18 sine functions build the final hourly curve for any given year. And it means the model can reproduce common features like, those double peaks you often see in daily demand, maybe noon and then evening. And it accounts for the typical drop in activity on weekends compared to weekdays.
So the big question then is, did this complex clockwork actually work? Did it predict reality accurately? How did the validation against real-world data go?
The validation seems to have been pretty thorough and honestly quite successful. They calibrated and tested the model using actual historical load data from 57 different countries chosen for their diversity. The accuracy, which they measured using the R-squared value, that's a statistical measure of how well the model's predictions match reality, was generally very high, often hitting around 0.99, which is close to perfect. And maybe more importantly for grid planning, for 41% of the countries tested, the error in predicting the absolute peak load was within a tight band of plus or minus 5%.
That sounds pretty good. Can you give us an example of a country where the model really nailed it, and then maybe one where it highlighted some limitations, the exceptions that prove the rule, so to speak?
Sure. Sweden was a standout success story. The model achieved a near-perfect R-squared, and the peak load deviation was tiny, only 0.8%. The predicted load profile very accurately matched Sweden's real-world pattern. Higher demand in winter, those dual daily peaks around noon and evening. It shows the model works really well for these northern developed economies where those 5 factors we discussed are major drivers.
Okay, and where did it stumble a bit?
A really interesting limitation popped up when they modeled Iran. Now, the model did a good job capturing the strong summer peak driven by high temperatures, showing it could handle warm climates. But there was a very clear, sharp divergence between the model's prediction and the actual load data during March.
March. Why March?
Well, because the model, as sophisticated as it is with economic and physical factors, doesn't currently include the influence of specific religious or public holidays. And late March is when Nowruz, the Iranian New Year, takes place. It's a major holiday period where economic activity and even residential patterns change significantly, leading to a big drop in electricity demand that the model just couldn't anticipate.
That's fascinating. It's a perfect example of where these large-scale physical and economic models bump up against local culture and specific events. The math can be brilliant, but it can't predict a holiday shutdown.
Exactly. It highlights an area for potential future refinement. But despite that kind of specific event-based limitation, the overall takeaway is that this research provides a really crucial starting point for anyone studying the global energy transition. By offering these hourly load projections out to 2100, it fills a major gap. It gives planners the kind of high-resolution data they desperately need to figure out how to build and operate power systems that will rely more and more on variable renewables like wind and solar.
So wrapping up the main contribution here, it's about creating this single unified framework, long-term load projection in high resolution for all countries globally. that manages to be both ambitious in its long-term economic view, assuming convergence, while also being really granular and grounded in accounting for those specific local factors, whether it's baseload industry in Russia or electric heating dependence in France.
Precisely. And while the model, as presented, is remarkably robust, it really just sets the stage for the next wave of research. Future work really needs to start explicitly incorporating the impact of emerging technology trends. Think about electric vehicles, charging en masse, the spread heat pumps, and critically, the role of large-scale energy storage. These things will fundamentally reshape those future demand curves, potentially smoothing out the peaks the current study projects.
Yeah, that leads perfectly into a final thought for you, our listeners, to maybe chew on. If these future technologies, things like smart EV charging, vehicle to grid, widespread home batteries, if they can be strategically used to actively reduce or shift peak demand away from those critical, expensive hours, how might that ultimately change the fundamental relationship we've seen between a country's wealth, its GDP, and the maximum peak load its grid needs to handle way out in the year 2100? Will wealth still equal peakiness? That's something to mull over until our next deep dive.